On the gray morning of September 23, 1931, Goodyear workers practiced moving the Akron's bow, then her stern, out of the air dock. Ground handling parties manned winch cars that rode on tracks embedded in the ground. Akronites lined the surrounding hills to watch as the ship was positioned and made ready. The captain ordered all lines cast off and the nose spindle unlocked from the mast. Thousands cheered as the largest, heaviest aircraft ever produced slowly lifted into the sky. Her first test flight took her 30 miles up to Cleveland and then back around Akron, stopping traffic everywhere she passed overhead. Akron's control surfaces were found to be overbalanced, and operators had to be relieved at 15-minute intervals until twilight found the giant back home for docking. This and other minor faults were corrected in subsequent trial flights into October. Skilled tradesmen stopped work to lend a hand on the spider lines, easing their pride and joy into the mast cup and safely back into the air dock. After her 9th trial flight, which covered 2,000 miles and lasted 48 hours, Naval Inspector Lieutenant Tex Settle formally accepted the new airship. As he signed, the product of Arnstein and Litchfield became property of the U.S. Navy. On the 21st of October, propellers 3, 4, 7, and 8 were tilted downward to push Akron skyward as she left the air dock for the last time. Arriving at Lakehurst for a high-type mooring, she was docked next to the smaller Los Angeles. On Navy Day, local dignitaries arrived to welcome the new crew, and USS Akron was commissioned as a vessel of the U.S. fleet. The first watch was set and a new ship's log was opened. America was proud of her new sky giant, the largest and most advanced symbol of national power in the sky. But Lakehurst officers knew she was only an experimental prototype aircraft, and her crew had a lot to learn. It was no small task just finding one's way around the big ship. If you entered through the bow hatch, you would follow down the centerline passageway past the bow cabins. Most forward were the captain's office and his cabin. Both featured a celluloid window looking down alongside the control car. Senior officers shared windowed cabins across the hall. Next aft was the aerologist office. Adjacent was the radio shack, featuring the most powerful mobile transceivers then built. Next aft was Main Ring 170, the terminus that connected the two side keel walkways. A ladder gave access to the control car's aft windowed compartment, its stairway folded in flight. Moving forward in the bus-size enclosure, one passed the navigator station. When entering the bridge, the altitude pilot, who controlled the elevators, was to port. The helmsman, whose wheel controlled the rudders, was most forward. From Main Ring 170, one could reach the main keel walkways, extending the length of the ship all the way aft to Main Ring 35. The floorboard was only 4 inches wide, but all the engine rooms were accessible on this level. Each engine room would support a 2,600-pound Maybach engine. Engine commands run up on telegraphs on the bridge were wire-tugged back to repeating telegraphs on each engine room control panel. For greater efficiency, each propeller turned in the opposite direction from the one ahead of it. Several different prop pitch angles were tried during the builder's trials. The 8 big power plants consumed tons of fuel every hour. To compensate, exhaust was fed through hull-mounted radiators to condense water made in the combustion process. The water would be collected into 28 2-ton bags, 4 1-ton bags, and a dozen half-ton quick-release bags. In the Bay 7 port side passageway, one found the ladder that connected to the lower level. Luxurious compared with the hammocks of ZR-1, the passageway featured permanent chairs. Opposite the windows were the enlisted and chief petty officers' berthing spaces. The crew was hot bunked. In other words, one man would use the cot while the other owner was on watch. All the way aft, just below engine 8, was the enlisted head, complete with hot and cold running water. A special walkway led from the crew's quarters on the port side across the hangar bay to the back door in the enlisted mess. Coffee and meals could be passed through a portal from the galley. Meals were prepared in the fire-resistant galley's propane stove, which was equipped with a vent hood. The chief petty officer's mess was next forward along the walkway. Next was the officer's mess, which would be the site of formal meals with tablecloths and fine silver. The mess attendant carried the meals down the window-lined companionway. Furthest aft, a fireproof enclosure held the generator room. 2 Universal Lighting Company 30-horsepower engines turned 8-kilowatt dynamos to supply the ship's electrical power. Air to cool their radiators came from a scoop forward of engine 7. Separate windings supplied 28 and 110-volt direct current, while a motor generator developed the 300 volts needed for the radio set's tubes. There was enough power for 150 lights and even the airplane starter motors. Admiral Moffett got things rolling by hosting a group of journalists and radiomen for a 3-city tour. The newsmen filled the crew's quarters to enjoy the view from the Bay 7 windows. Remote broadcasts were being made over Washington, D.C., as the USS Los Angeles joined the flight. On the 3rd of November, Akron carried 207 persons aloft, establishing a long-lasting record. As 1931 came to an end, Akron had logged some 300 air hours. The ZRS ships would need to operate with the fleet. The Navy had installed an at-sea mooring mast on the oiler Patoka, making it an airship tender. Proven by ZR-1, the mast was then extended for the larger ships to come. Patoka had supported Los Angeles for a 3-week exercise in 1931, faithfully delivering everything from ice to antifreeze. On January 17, 1932, off Hampton Roads, Virginia, it was Akron's turn. Skipper Rosendahl was wary of the whole tender concept, since handling was tricky. If the wind shifted opposite the tide, the airship could foul on the tender superstructure. With booms handling the yaw lines, Akron was reeled in and locked in the cup. Akron had to be conned at the mast as if she were flying to prevent her tail from dipping in the ocean. Using the centerline passageway and bow door, personnel could transfer from ship to ship. Hand-carried provisions were threaded down through the centerline passage to the main ring 170, then outboard and aft. Connections just below the nose spindle carried fuel, ballast water, helium, portable water, and electrical power from the tender. Provisions pumped aboard had to be carefully controlled. Commands were signaled from the bridge via rotary annunciator similar to an engine telegraph. Some 12,000 pounds of oil and about 110,000 pounds of gasoline would be loaded evenly along the keels. The altitude pilot's weight board, calibrated by individual bays, was continually updated to manage the overall tonnage and to prevent excessive strain on any part of the ship's structure. Bay 7, which supported the aircraft hangar, was loaded last. The tender's mast allowed servicing the airship while on duty with the fleet, requiring only a sheltered body of water. The successful experiment opened the door to distant deployments. However, wartime Zeppelins and even the Army's current blimps carried deployable scouts. Early in April, USS Akron's small Bay 7 doors were unbolted and flipped up. It was time for the debut of Akron's cloud car, weighed down with a dummy for the first test. An electric winch turned a 1,000-foot-long cable drum to extend the spy basket. This first test showed the car was dangerously unstable. Its wild oscillations could have damaged the airship or even fouled a propeller. It was hauled back in, and when Akron docked, the cloud car was removed for analysis. Back at Goodyear's air dock, lessons learned on Akron's construction were paying off in faster construction on the new ZRS-5. Navy Secretary Ingalls signaled for the first main ring to be hoisted into place. Her sub-assemblies were already well underway, and the now experienced construction crew made better time with their second effort. The second prototype would come in for half the cost of Akron, and several thousand pounds were shaved off her weight as well. It was obvious that at least one complete West Coast facility would be needed. When the Navy considered a 1,700-acre site near San Jose, local businessmen bought the land and offered it to the Navy for free. The lobby for Mountain View won out. The foundation for a West Coast air dock was laid. Back east, Akron's first fleet problem was staged in January of 1932. Even while operating like a 1917 Zeppelin without planes, Akron found the mock enemy force of destroyers in a manner no aircraft of the day could have hoped to. But it was not the decisive miracle some expected. Akron missed the destroyers on the first day, in spite of the exercise having been constructed to encourage their location. The airship's scouting future lay with her airplanes, and it was time to bring them into operation. But first, the Akron's trapeze would have to be finished. In March of 1932, the engineers at Lakehurst were hard at work on the problem. In haste, the Los Angeles trapeze was temporarily cannibalized for parts. By now, the N2Y utility plane sported another useful modification. A removable fuselage combing had been added to accommodate bulky cargo. The bright yellow trainer color had been replaced with the standard navy gray at the same time. On the 3rd of May, Akron took to the air and overflew the New Jersey coast. Akron's big hangar bay door was unbolted and hand-winched open. The freshly made trapeze was swung out, with a front cockpit cameraman cranking from another airplane. Lieutenants Harrington and Young flew out to perform the first hook-ons. Entering the airship's slipstream was a bit tricky, since the airship created its own boundary layer close to its surface. But the pilots' experience by experimental flying with the Los Angeles quickly adapted to the larger airship. The pilots developed techniques for repeatable success hooking on the trapeze. They would side-slip into the airship's boundary layer, powering to slightly above the target, then stalling out so the hook fell on the bar and latched securely. If not perfectly centered, kicking the plane's rudder would usually center the hook on the bar. The lower fins emergency control station was not a favorite place to watch this evolution, since as the 8 huge propellers pushed the airship up to airplane handling speed, the double-quadruple prop wash caused the ship's tail to vibrate badly. Some men experienced air sickness while on duty there, as if on board an airplane. Above the trapeze in Bay 7, the winch operator manned his platform foot switch atop the airplane truss. The little 5-cylinder 1,600-pound N2Y was easily hauled aboard by the 5-speed winch. It would be possible to exchange small loads of cargo using the little airplanes as a surface ship would use her running boats. The N2Y was held stable by the 3-point mounting of hook and strong points on the wing. Strapped in, with goggles down, the trapeze operator swung the aviators out into the slipstream. The engine was started. The 110-volt starter cable was unplugged and passed back up to the trapeze. Another winch uncoupled the center or third pole as the guide pins released the wings and retracted. The U-shaped bar simultaneously lowered the aircraft into launch position. When ready, the pilot pulled his release handle to open the hook. In an instant, the plane's weight carried it out of the slipstream as the pilot applied throttle to proceed. But there were teething problems. During one evolution, a hook jammed when the release cable had slackened and the airplane would not drop off. A few minutes pounding freed the mechanism in this case, but this kind of delay would be intolerable in combat. Eventually, the entire hook and release mechanism was redesigned. The airship needed a fast, stable scout, and having a second man to observe, navigate, and operate the radio would have been ideal. But the N2Ys were slow and lacked the range to scout for the airship. Former training aircraft, they did not even have radios to report their sightings. However, the airship did have a new fighter plane on the way. The XF-9C1, with its 9-cylinder right radial engine, was 1,000 pounds heavier than the N2Y. Since regular production was already underway, the first try needed to show that the more sophisticated 420 horsepower Curtiss fighter could be recovered and taken aboard. Having practiced first on the Los Angeles, Lieutenant Young approached the big ship and latched on the first try. Measurements had shown that the 25-foot 5-inch wingspan would seem to fit, and the tail was slightly shorter than the N2Y. The retraction test commenced. Young guided the stabilizing pins into the wing mount as the bar was retracted. Locked against wobbling, the XF-9C1 was hauled aboard as Young cut his engine. The 5-horsepower winch pulled in a long ton of airplane with ease. Once the aircraft's weight had been secured to the trolley car, it was safe for the pilot to climb out. Assembled from various parts not originally designed to work together, the system had worked. In May of 1932, USS Akron had at last qualified as an airplane-carrying airship. But the entire concept of flying aircraft carrier was far from mature. The bad press that had plagued Akron during construction now dogged her in operation. Headline grabbers ignored the fact that prototype aircraft rarely met all their design goals. Pushed into operation before her builder's trials were even over, Akron's carved wooden props couldn't push her to the expected speed of 70 miles an hour. This very expensive symbol of national prestige was even called overweight. Congress named a committee to look into the matter. Akron was prepared for a congressional inspection flight on February 22, 1932. Strong winds across the hangar that morning made undocking her quite dangerous. But Skipper Rosendahl and his officers wanted to give the politicians a good showing and began undocking at 0938. As the congressional delegation watched, the 14-knot gust grabbed the tail and ripped the mooring fittings out of the main rings. Free from the heavy stern beam, the Akron kited out of control. Rosendahl had rushed aboard to drop tail ballast, but it was too late. Her lower fins smashed into the ground,
And just today, when they wanted to show her off for the boys from Washington, are they embarrassed?
The light damage to the main structure verified the strength of the deep ring design. But when long-delayed wind tunnel tests finally showed that the fin's reinforcing was too weak in its forward third, no one believed the test to be accurate. More tests were ordered. A team from Goodyear arrived to rebuild the tail, but during her repairs in March and April, political enemies capitalized on the embarrassing incident. The repaired Akron was prepared for a West Coast expedition in the spring. Loaded with 15 tons of water and 40 tons of gasoline, Akron left Lakehurst on the 8th of May. The XF-9C-1 and one of the N-2Ys flew up and hooked on for a free ride to the West Coast. But the clear skies did not last. Akron encountered turbulent weather over the central states and dust storms over Texas. Crossing mountains was not part of the design criteria for a ship designed to be operated over sea level. The gas cells keeping her buoyant at 300 feet would expand and lose helium at 5,000 feet. Skipper Rosendahl took Akron through the mountain pass the Graf Zeppelin took in the 1929 round-the-world flight. After the turbulent crossing, Akron arrived near San Diego. Rosendahl dispatched Scott Peck down to the surface via N-2Y to act as mooring officer. But the plane was not recalled, and even the XF-9C-1 was launched. A team of untrained recruits from San Diego boot camp were mustered as a landing crew. Told to grab the lines when the airship dropped down, the inexperienced recruits simply stared in awe as the ocean liner-sized vehicle bore down on them, then passed on by. While Akron went around for another pass, the ground handling chief shouted reprimands and demanded that the recruits grab the lines and hang on the next time. The second time, the recruits did grab and hold on, and soon the nose cable was connected. The desert sun superheated the nearly empty ship, now no longer cooled by motion. Suddenly, 5 tons of water ballast was accidentally released aft, and the tail strained against the sailors ordered to hold her. Rosendahl knew there was safety in the air and ordered, "Let go all lines." The mooring cable was axed in half, but men aft did not hear the order. Straining to hold helium that could easily lift them all, one by one the men gave up until only 3 hung on to the toggles. In an effort to save them, Rosendahl endangered the ship by valving helium he could not replace. But it was to no avail as the line handler's strength waned. In full view of the newsreel cameramen, first Harold Edsel, then Nigel Hinton fell to their deaths. Bud Cowart's inboard position placed him above other toggles, and he was able to stand on one, then secure himself to a line. Akron crewmen struggled with the tangled lines for more than an hour before hauling him on board. Bud was soon sitting in the crew's quarters passageway talking to cameramen. In the cool of the evening, Akron was finally moored, her tail riding a trolley car following the circular track. Since no helium was staged at Camp Kearney, more bad press followed when Akron had to miss the scheduled fleet exercises.
Again, the unlucky Akrons in the Tufsby Special, not very long after her accident at Lakehurst last February.
Continuing north to the Golden Gate, Akron moored to Patoka and replenished helium lost while trying to stop at San Diego. Now she could finally leave San Francisco and fly south. Construction on the new West Coast air dock was underway as Akron tied up at Mountain View and picked up the rest of the crew. Akron's first Pacific exercise came in June. Skipper Rosendahl again left his airplanes behind as Akron scouted for the Green Force. Finding the adversaries early the next morning, Akron shadowed the White Force, which answered by launching its seaplanes to attack the airship. Akron avoided many of the planes by dodging in and out of the clouds. Rosendahl considered airplane attack frivolous, as the airship's fighters and its own guns would have dealt with it. He felt that the airship itself should do the scouting, possibly using the spy basket. Rosendahl later took Akron up the coast to allow the Pacific Northwest to look at the ship. People there had not seen a dirigible since the USS Shenandoah's visit 7 years earlier. After several weeks of exercises, provisions were loaded aboard as the Akron swung at the Mountain View mast. Props 1, 2, 7, and 8 were turned downward and engaged on the 11th of June. In some ways, going home was more challenging than the trip over. Number 3 propeller carried away. Approaching the precarious mountain pass with a full cross-country load of provisions, the Akron was dangerously heavy. Rosendahl ordered the 2 pilots to their planes at 0430 hours. The N-2Y and the XF-9C-1 were launched into the early morning blackness, lightening the load. After crossing the narrow passage, Akron refused to open her door and readmit the planes. Both planes had to follow the railroads back to Lakehurst on their own. The ship's static condition was not very satisfactory even then, and she used dynamic lift to carry her weight. After dumping fuel to clear the Rockies, Akron masted to refuel at the Class B facility at Parris Island, South Carolina. The last leg ended as Lakehurst Railroad mast and its powerful mooring winch pulled Akron's spindle into its flower pot. Weary pioneers descended the accommodation ladder, ending the 38-day mission. Rosendahl spoke to the press as Hangar 1's doors closed on the 15th of June. The deployment had not proved the value of a scout airship. Meanwhile, influential Southern Congressman Carl Vinson lobbied to have the second Zeppelin Rigid Scout named after the largest city in his district. So it happened that a delegation from Macon, Georgia arrived at Akron's air dock on the 4th of July. Socialite Susan Myrick blew a whistle to raise the ZRS-5 nose girder section, and the group watched the bow being riveted in place. There had been serious discussion of adding another 22.5-meter bay to the new ship. This would have increased her overall length to 859 feet. Her useful lift would have increased by 40,000 pounds to 210,000 pounds, and her maximum range could have been 11,500 miles. However, clamshell doors would have had to have been added to Lakehurst Hangar 1, and Goodyear could not come to an agreement with the Navy. After all, the first two airships were to be the test articles. Then there would be time to redesign when enough operational data had been collected. There was a great deal of work to be done before displacement vessels carrying airplanes would occupy the sky above the fleet.